That's right. You feel free to come up to the front and I guess do some good social distancing. Just testing, my microphone's working. Yep. Ian, would you be able to look on the screen and just make sure I'm in the image of the camera there? Yeah, of course you can, Ian, yep. That's good, okay. So can I welcome you to the Church of the Resurrection and to our talk today. The risk will be that I'll talk for too long, but I'll start with this movie back in, it says 1986, but I'm sure, so sometime about that time I was at college and my wife and I went to see the movie. Oh, what happened then? Nothing. No, let's try it from back there. Might work better.
Little in this world unfolds as we predict. Indeed, how could the Indians have supposed that the death of this unsung priest would bring among them a man whose life was to become inextricably intertwined with their own?
Tell them they must leave the mission.
They say it is the will of God. They came out of the jungle with a vision. They didn't understand why God has changed his mind. You should never become a priest.
But I am a priest and they need me. If you die with blood on your hand, you betray everything we've done.
If might is right, love has no place in the world.
A man of war. A man of peace. A land of timeless beauty. An age of conquest. The laws of heaven. The way of the world. The lives in the balance. Now, from the director of The Killing Fields, comes this year's winner of the Best Picture Award at the Cannes Film Festival. The Mission.
Okay, so as I said, when I was at college, the movies like The Mission came out. We were also hearing about people in the Philippines who are rising up against their president, and particularly the Catholic Church played a very important role in what they called the basic Christian communities, and liberation theology was very much a part of gathering people together to think about how do we read the Bible when we're all suffering profoundly. And the tension that comes through in that movie is, do we hold on to as one of the priest characters there was, no, well, I need to get on and celebrate the Eucharist, the Mass, and be the priest through my sacraments. The other priest, Robert De Niro's character, was taking up the sword, which he was very familiar with. According to the movie, that was he'd been a soldier. And so in most of Latin America, places like the Philippines, in South America as well, there was this movement of liberation theology. And it saddens me to think that the Filipinos have just elected the son of the person they booted out in the 1980s. And yeah, so horrified. But anyway, where were we? We were down the south of Brazil. So just to give you an idea, Rio was 1,200 kilometres north of us, kind of northeast of us. And Florianopolis was our capital city, and it was about not quite 500 kilometres directly to the east of us. The Iguazu Falls, Foz do Iguaçu, were about 500 kilometres to the west, slightly to the north of us. Just to give you an idea, the blue line running across the bottom there is not the Tropic of Capricorn, it's a line going, I chose North Lakes up the road here because it seemed to be almost exactly the same latitude as Concordia, on the advantages of YouTube and Google and all those things, as you can look up these things. So Concordia is at a latitude of 27.23 and North Lake's 27.22. And so that gives you an idea. We were basically, if you headed out east from here or west from here, you'd land up in Concordia or near enough. And so, but a bit like being, say, at Toowoomba or Malani or somewhere, we were colder than Florianopolis on the coast. Florianopolis is basically an island, and it's more or less like Fraser Island and Moreton Island and Stradbroke all together. Very beautiful. Someone asked, was your son in Brazil? That small child on the left-hand side is my son Jeremy, who's next year will turn 30. But as you can see there, he's only about 18 months old. And my daughter Freya on the right-hand side was 4. And Eleanor, she was 8 when we went and had her 9th birthday at the language school in Brasilia. My parents-in-law only had 3 grandchildren in those days. And when we said, oh, by the way, we're going to go and move to Brazil, my father-in-law, their grandfather just became catatonic. He was beside himself with anxiety, worrying about whether he would ever see his 3 grandchildren again. He'd heard so many horrible things. There's a horrible movie called Cidade de Deus, which is the name of a suburb in Rio. Oh, just horrendous, where these children go around with guns shooting people. When we got to Brazil, we discovered the church was actually just a skeleton of a church. It didn't even have those bricks down the bottom there. It was just the pillars and the beams. And when we got there, we realised we're going to have to physically work to build this place. That's Gwen and I standing at the entrance, or it's actually the entrance to the hall. Upstairs is the church, as you can see. So the next slide, you get a sense of it going up and up, bit by bit, the church up the top. But you can kind of get a sense, there's wooden windows up the top there at this stage, and the windows down the bottom have already been in the weather for too long and they're going rusty and horrible. But yeah, in behind the other side of that building, there's the road there, Rua Portugal, which is where we were living, and that was a little supermarket we used to go to if we'd run out of something. But in those days, Gwen was still smoking, and she could go there and she'd ask for a packet of cigarettes, and they'd be something horrendously expensive, like $3 a packet. I said, oh, don't you have anything cheaper? And she'd pull out from underneath the counter the stuff from Paraguay, and it was only $1.50 because they weren't paying tax on that. The fellow in the white shirt there was the church warden. we discovered the reason the church was only a skeleton, because he needed a swimming pool more than the parish needed a church. And so the second time in the history of the church in Concordia was that they lost money. So the confidence in the church, the Anglican church, actually we used to call it Igreja Episcopal Anglicana do Brasil. It's kind of got that American Episcopal and the Anglican. But yeah, this was the second time. The first time was 20 or something years earlier, and the priest decided he'd go into local politics where he would earn, when we were there, they were earning like a couple of $1,000s a month, whereas the parish priest was probably earning 2 minimum salaries, about $300 a month. And so he was going to use this building fund money for the church down the centre of town. He gobbled it all up in doing his advertising, whatever, for his election. Didn't get in, and so had to quietly disappear to another part of the diocese or somewhere. So they'd never quite forgiven him. This guy then decided that he needed a swimming pool, tiny little swimming pool, only good for wading in summer, but anyway. So that's welcome to Brazil and corruption and just chaos. Before we left, we were able to celebrate the consecration of the church, and to a large extent that was because Gwen was courted by an English school who said, "You speak English? You're the only English-speaking person in the town apart from your husband. Would you like to teach some classes of English in our school?" And Gwen said, "I don't know anything about teaching. I'm an occupational therapist." But anyway, they twisted her arm, and the way they did that, because Gwen, it was my visa that we were there under, they said, "I'll tell you what, we'll pay for you to have a cleaner in your house, and we'll give the other half of what would be your salary to the church," and it went straight into the building fund. So the church was finished. Didn't have that lovely cross on, they put that after we left. It was, so after 6 years, finally, the church had and able then to begin to build the community. I just wanted to show you this photo for a couple of reasons. Those who worship here would know about Godly Play in this community. In Birkdale, where we were for a while before we came here, we had Godly Play, and my wife has been involved in teaching it there as well as here. And my wife set it up there, and this young lady in the back there, Jessie, she was obviously helping Gwen. Looks quite positive to have all those kids there. Not sure how many of them in the church now, but more than probably what we've got in our church at the moment. Jessie recently, last year I think it was made a deacon in the church, and when she sent me a message on Facebook, she said it was because of our ministry that had continued to impact upon her life. I whacked in the word salão there. Have you ever come across futebol salão? It's because it's the football you play in the hall. And so that's where that word comes from. Futebol, of course, is that sort of Portuguese way of saying football. So there's Jessie on the left-hand side, second in from the left, being made a deacon, or just having been made a deacon. So that was pretty special for me to hear about that and to celebrate that with her. Our kids went to this, Jeremy and Freya anyway, went to this little school. You can't quite see them, my photos. I probably should have brought it in closer. But they're standing in front of that mural. Gwen did the mural with the help of the teachers and what have you on their fence. But what she did was get the kids in the school to do drawings, and then took those drawings, put them all together in one big painting and put it onto the fence. And so it was It's actually called Escola Archi Educação, the education of art in the school. So it was a kind of kindergarten, preschool, and went up to year 2. And so Freya was able to do that for most of her time there, and then did correspondence from Australia. Jeremy was there the whole of his time. And Eleanor, oh no, I haven't got the image of her school in here, but she went to another private school. Compared to missionaries working in Brazil, in Rio, where the private Anglican school there, it was a bit like Nudgee College or somewhere cost an arm and a leg to go to. Fortunately, where we were, the schools didn't cost an arm and a leg. I wanted to show you this house. Favela is a Portuguese word for slum, and this house is in Nova Brasilia. It's probably about 3 kilometres out of town, and people have been living there for decades, and not much changes really. They might add a bit onto their house here or there, but basically it's the same. When we first started going down there, we sort of knocked on the door and went and had that drink that I was drinking out there before, the chimarrão, with the family there, and got to know them a little bit. While we were there, we could hear this person crying out, and we said, well, who's that? What's that noise? And there's a funny little cabin. I wouldn't have used it for my chickens. And the lady took us across to meet a man there, and she would go and give him a bit of soup or some food or something. So she lived in poverty. She would do a bit of cleaning. Her husband broke rocks, a bit like the convicts used to do here 150 years ago. That's what he was doing. He actually, at one stage prior to us arriving, he'd knocked out a rock, because they used to have to bring the rock out of the cliff face, and he knocked it out and it smashed his knee, and for a couple of years he was not able to work. So they just survived on her income. But so she used to go and visit this old man in this little scungy little house. So out of her own poverty, she went to him, and he was living in what, you know, the film or the musical Les Miserables? Well, he lived in misery, and misery was the word that was often used more so in the north of Brazil for real poverty. So they had kind of levels of poverty, and that Les Miserables is because of the levels of poverty around the world. Their daughter, after she'd finished year 10, I suppose, at school, was finding it too difficult to keep going to school, and her parents would have wanted to go and get a job, but because she couldn't afford the bus fare to get into town to go to the high school, and so she actually came and stayed with us for those couple of years and was able to do high school while staying with us. Her friend must have had enough money, and so she kept catching the bus. Now these folk here, I don't know if you can read with that blue background, but that lady and her husband and the 4 children lived in a house which was about 3 metres by 6 metres, and so I've had garden sheds that big, and basically that they had this tiny little space for their wood stove and effectively their kitchen. The folk next door had wires going up over the electricity poles to catch some of the electricity that was going by and ran them into their house. These guys were just using transistor radio, no TV, unlike others, and transistor radio and a wood stove that would be more smoke coming out through the... Anyway, but if you weren't sitting chatting to them, you could see the people in the little prison just next door, and they would sit there and say, these guys get 3 meals a day. How good is that? And so a little bit of skullduggery was quite attractive to them because, well, what happens? You're going to end up in jail and get fed 3 meals a day. So we actually, when we came home halfway through the 6 years that we were in Brazil, we bought little rubber Australian animals that we gave to these 4 children. And next time I went back to visit, I said, oh, are the kids enjoying playing with their little rubber animals? And they got them down off the shelf, which was about 6 foot high, and where the kids couldn't reach, they were still in the plastic bag. So why? Well, these are foreign. They've never had anything that was international before. They were too good for the kids to play with. That wasn't going to happen. Like these were like $5, if that. I don't know. We wouldn't have, we hadn't to spend a lot. It was a few dollars.
Can I ask a question? Was this poverty what we call intergenerational poverty?
Completely intergenerational. So that other house before, I sat down with them and their neighbours one day. I was talking to the kids that were in that sort of year 9, 10 at school, and I said, oh, what do you want to do when you finish school? And this girl said, oh, maybe I'll become a maid. And my heart just sank. I thought, that's what your mother does. And I'm thinking, if I'd asked my kids the same, they would have said, oh, maybe be a doctor or an astronaut or who knows? I'll travel the world. But not these kids. When they brought their homework home, Mum and Dad couldn't help them because Mum and Dad couldn't read and write. Like when I was growing up, we had, Encyclopedia Britannica or something there on the shelf that you could pull out, or the Children's Britannica or the Science and other, But no, they had no books, and Mum and Dad couldn't read and write, and they barely had a pencil. Gwen was trying to teach one group of ladies to do patchwork and stuff. He said they could hardly hold a pencil. They hadn't held pencils and they couldn't draw daisies because they just didn't have that dexterity anymore to draw a simple daisy to do patchwork. So that you're right, it becomes generational. And yes, so what do you want to do? You want to be like Mum or Dad, maybe? That's the height of their imagination. There's like a glass ceiling, and it's very low, I can tell you. If you're a bit wealthier, you couldn't get into these houses. They are about 6 by 6. The laundry would be the tub outside where you had to wash with your ripple board. The ripple board is actually made into the concrete tub. No garage or anything like that, and it was the bathroom toilet was one little room inside the 6 by 6 metre house. And people would be moving in while the curbing and channeling was just like that. No such thing. But those people from Nova Brasilia would not be able to get into because they didn't have secure income. You need to have enough secure income to move into the Cohabe, the public housing. I mentioned Gwen's English class. This is a photo of Gwen's English class, some of them anyway. They went to Iguazu for their English-speaking weekend. Gwen said there wasn't much English speaking on that weekend, but anyway, that was the plan. They flew there. The fellow with the moustache, he had his private plane. He was the local GM dealer, also had his private plane because he had a grazing property and, would need to commute to other parts of Brazil, and came to Australia at one time to get stuff to inseminate his cattle and what have you. They had doctors and people like that in their class. and one of the other fellows, I think, was a doctor, and he owned a plane as well. So they flew to Iguazu for the weekend to go and have their English-speaking class. So this was the group that Gwen was relating to. We went to, I can't remember his name, Remy? No, I don't remember. Anyway, with the moustache, he lived on the 7th and 8th floor of his own penthouse that he owned. He rented out all the other floors, there's 6 floors. And, you know, he told us about how he had a chandelier that he'd bought in Europe, and he had the poor electrician in there one day trying to install it up on the 8th floor, but over this space. So it would have been like hanging it up here somewhere. And the electrician somehow dropped it and the whole thing smashed. And of course the electrician, I'll pay for it. And he just had to say, look, your income, you'll be paying me off for the next 30 or 40 years. You can't do it, you just have to forget about it. For him, the cost of it was a significant amount of money, but for the electrician, it would have been impossible. And that was, so one day I'd been to that couple visiting where they could see the little prison, and that night we went to his house for dinner with this group of people, and you just saw this outrageous gap. And that was, our town was a small town. In a place like Rio, I remember walking past through the favela up to the sporting club that the rich people owned up on the hill there in Rio. And I'm thinking, here are these guys playing tennis over there, and they'd ring the little kiosk, which was part of their sporting club, and say, can you bring a cold drink over to me over here at Tennis Court 5 or whatever it was. They'd be on their mobile phone and ring up. And they kind of lived as if the favelas on either side of this sports club just didn't exist. It's kind of completely mind-boggling. So there we were at Iguazu with our friend Miriam, and it is fantastic, and it's worth going to if you ever get to Brazil or to Argentina, because it's at that point where Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil all meet. But yeah, we actually, because it was relatively close, we went there a few times each. I don't know if you can see this picture properly, but the man there has got barbecue on skewers in Brazil, a bit like the cattle that were out there on that little statuette things. The Gaúcho culture was very strong, and so barbecues were big. And when they did barbecues at church functions even, where mostly it was pigs because we were the capital of the roast barbecue in Concordia, they would cater 700 grams per person of meat. Mostly it was the men that ate a kilo and the women that had less than 700 grams. But this fellow also cooked armadillo for us one day we were there, and frog for us another day when we were there. They had, there was a kind of a really rustic, and they were kind of perhaps a bit closer to the Indian lifestyle than he's quite white, he's probably got German origins or something. But they'd been there, many of the Germans had been there for a bit like Nunda and Lutwich, since 1850s or whenever they came. And they were there much as that. And in some towns they spoke more German than they spoke Portuguese, still 4 or 5 generations later. One of the things, when I first came home from Brazil, I would take my kids to the local park and then think, but wait a minute, there's an even better park just down the road, and I know there's another park over there. And they'd all be way better than anything we saw in Brazil, although in the centre of our town, Concordia, in the main square, they had this fantastic children's merry-go-round, but you had to drive it by hand. It was as dangerous as all get out. If you didn't get it balanced properly, someone's leg would get broken. And after we left, the council took it away. But I'd have my kids and I'd put the two little ones up there and Eleanor down the bottom, and you could swing it. And of course other kids would go, I want to go on this thing. Had 6 seats, but I'd have to shuffle the kids around to make sure this kid looks about the same weight as Eleanor. I'll put the two there and this one. And I'd be doing this balancing thing because the other seats would just swing like crazy and they would whack into kids. But great fun as long as you kept it balanced. But yeah, it was, I don't know, I mean, the colours were beautiful, but they were, it was pretty, we're so spoilt here for playgrounds and for public amenities. There's all the swimming pools there are owned by clubs. There's no city council pools. And so the average bear doesn't know how to swim and never has any opportunity to learn unless you live at the coast. And of course where we were was nearly 500 kilometres from the coast. I put this image in of the footpath there again. I remember after dropping the kids at school or something, walking home and thinking, isn't this footpath wonderful? And you bonkers would say, what are you celebrating a footpath for? It's just a footpath. But I'd noticed that the council obviously been along and there must have been a little bit of a thing where the concrete had risen up or something and they'd grinded it down so you wouldn't trip on it. That didn't happen in Brazil. If you fell over, well, that was just too bad. The footpath, and that's right in the centre of town. Out where we were, there was often no footpaths and you were walking on the road most of the time. But yeah, it was, and there was one part where you walk past, normally as we walked into town, you'd go past this big gutter thing and it was fine most of the time, but the rails were just across like that and the kids could sort of lean over and you think, oh, don't fall in, you'll hurt yourself. It's about a 3-metre drop. But when it was raining, that was a torrent running down there, and I thought, strike me, if one of the kids fell into that, that'd be the end of them. I mean, they wouldn't just...
Predisposition, I mean, a lot of poverty, a lot of sort of poor countries, there's a predisposition that you have an accident, maybe that's some sort of a fate.
Yeah, there's... Yeah. Yes. Oh, I know exactly what you mean. In Brazil, they had a phrase, "Se Deus quiser," which means if God wills it. And I actually felt, whether I'm right or not, I have no idea, that the influence from the Portuguese and the Spanish, influenced by the Moors who occupied that whole section of Spain and Portugal at one stage, excuse my throat, they did have a kind of a notion of fate, and it was, if God wills it, something would happen or not happen or whatever, and disasters happened, and heaven help you if you were making paving stones out of rock and you busted your knee up, well, that would be 2 years off work if you're lucky. And absolute poverty, you might end up in the misery rather than just in the poverty. I suppose I've got this photo because that's Copacabana Beach and this beautiful sandcastle there in the background. You can't quite see there, but the young people, there was a kind of real sense of the body, and probably more so in Rio than further south where we were. Brazilians celebrated the body unless they were Crenchies. Crenchies were the word actually means believers, and there was a very strong evangelical church kind of influence in parts of Brazil, and where they would go to church dressed from neck to knee or further down, probably right to the ankles, and would have had their best suits on that they'd somehow managed to get a hold of. But in most of Brazil, the body was celebrated big time, and people like me would go a bit, I would struggle to go to the beach in Copacabana. My wife said, she said to that fellow I had that image of the barbecue before, because he asked, what was Rio like? And it was Nicholas looking at the girls. Gwen said, I could always tell because his jaw dropped down to here. They were stunningly beautiful, but that's because they walked everywhere, up and down hill and down dale, and so but that mixture of colour that I spoke of before when we were outside. Really getting to the end. So that's San Miguel, and when I was using that word before for the bread, the word I was using, if you take the S off the front of the São, you make it into pão, and it's a bit like, I suppose, a bit like cow for a moo cow. It's got that kind of OW sound in English, a bit like that. And so São Miguel was actually in the movie The Mission, and it was one of the big mission stations. And when you went to the museum there, that's obviously just the ruins, but you could go there and you'd see these beautiful carvings that were done in the 16th century by the Indians. So they had some violins and other musical instruments there that the Indians had carved and played, and that was one of the things that came through in the movie, was that they taught these little Indian or indigenous children to sing the mass and what have you, and they could play these wonderful European musical instruments, but they also had, of course, their own instruments as well. So São Miguel was west of us. Probably southwest mainly, mostly south of us. My daughter went there on a school excursion, and on the way home, they weren't that far from home when it happened, but the bus swerved to miss a truck which was over their side of the road and ended up rolling down the hill. And we know, because you can have accidents that happen in Australia where a bus rolling down a hill can be complete disaster. People were hurt, but nobody died. My daughter had a bit of a bruised shin and I think probably still has a few problems from that to this day. But one of the things I felt was happening was that we as missionaries were supported in Brazil by faithful people praying for us. So if you know missionaries in other parts of the world, then please hold them in your prayers and lift them up. Freya had, what do you call when you get inflamed knees, was the symptom that we saw, and it affects your heart. Recently on the television talking about Aboriginal kids with, rheumatic heart fever. And fortunately, we could afford to take Freya to... well, that's right. We could afford to take Freya to a good doctor. He picked it up straight away and started a course of penicillin straight away, and she's come through with no damage to her heart whatsoever. We're hearing more recently about Aboriginal kids who are dying as teenagers because their hearts have been damaged and they're not getting sufficient treatment either when they first get it or later on. And I remember taking Jeremy with me on one occasion. I was going to do this Bible study. It was baptism preparation at someone's home. And their kids and with Jeremy said, "Oh, can Jeremy come and collect tadpoles with us?" And I said, "Oh yeah, where are you going to go?" And it was behind the dairy, and they had this pond there behind the dairy, and I thought it was only about that deep, and there was tadpoles in there. When they came running up screaming, "Jeremy's fallen in," I went in and stepped in to rescue him up to my chest. And what I realised was they wash out the dairy every now and again. All the cow manure goes into the pond and settles 3/4 of the depth of the pond. And so I just felt that all those prayers were holding my son afloat because he could not swim at that stage. Yeah. Now, that's my image from this painting here. Freya painted this beautiful painting, I suppose you'd call it, of a little girl called Tachiani. Talk about misery. Tachiani was a Guarani Indian, and her parents, she had hepatitis, I think it was. No, anyway, I've forgotten. But it affected, whatever it was, she was paralysed and couldn't speak and was unable to sit up, and would often, at their place, would just lie in bed, and they'd always be just giving her a milk bottle, a little, like a baby's bottle to drink. And our friend, who was a missionary, who was actually a Dutch nurse, she was there, and she said, "Can you guys just foster this little girl for a while to see if we can get her health better?" The trouble was the Brazilians didn't have a difference between adopting and fostering, so that was not good in the end. But anyway, Tachiani came to live with us, and Gwen and the young lass from Nova Brasilia was living with us, trying to brush her hair, just couldn't get the mats out, because they wanted to brush it so they could get the nits out, but it was all completely matted at the back, and they ended up cutting the hair, but then they could comb it properly. Then I was giving her a bath one day, and she did a wee in the bath. I went, "What's that?" And these little creatures came out with her wee. I could see these little things. They weren't that small. So she had some kind of bugs inside of her. She had nits in her hair. She was undernourished and just in misery. And that image that you can see there is of Tachiani, the hat, and you can't quite see the scarf and the thing they've got round there. My daughter Freya and her were playing dress-ups, and Gwen had been able to teach Tachiani to sit up, and the advantage of being a occupational therapist. And I suppose the thing about Tachiani was that she would smile, and it was as if the smile went from ear to ear. If you gave her any attention, this face would just light up. And when we took her to church or whatever, people would talk to Tachiani, and this little face would light up. If you picked her up, she would just kind of thump you on the shoulder. She couldn't say anything, but you just felt this enormous love from Tachiani. The thing I love about Freya's painting, she says, "Dad, I had none of this stuff in mind when I was doing it." She's painted with charcoal, she's painted it with coffee, and she's used cardboard. And it just speaks to me about the effectively slaves who produce coffee that you can buy here in Woolies or Coles. They get enticed to go and work in these places. And when they're working there, the little shop that they can go to is owned by the brother of the person who owns the coffee plantation. The same with the charcoal producers, because they love their barbecues, then just use wood or something. And I I trust that the bags of charcoal we can buy at the local shops here are not produced by the same sorts of people, but probably are, where people are working at, not even the $150 that the stone maker, was, but pittance. And then they couldn't, by the time they'd spent their money at the shop, which was overpriced, a bit like going to a very small IGA, you would end up, they had nothing left, and so they were always indebted because they'd had to pay for their truck ride to the place, and they had ways of holding them there. So the charcoal makers and the coffee people, a lot of rural people would go to the cities. Our first encounter with favelas was leaving Porto Alegre in the bus and just looking out the windows and seeing these favelas with cardboard houses and bits of tin over the top maybe, and tiny little dwellings. And so Freya's painting of Tatiana, you can kind of see paralysed written across the top there. But there's a whole, as Ian asked before, is this stuff generational? It's completely generational, partly because they can't afford to go to decent schools. And if, like our friend, if they want to go to high school, well, that's not possible because you can't afford the bus. I was listening to a girl on the radio here in Australia recently, and she said, when I first came to Australia she was from somewhere in Africa, she said, I got on the school bus and they didn't charge me to get on the school bus to go to the local state school. She said, that was amazing. You don't have to pay for the bus. It was all, so for her, this kind of realisation that equality means you can afford to get to school as well as to be able to go to school. It's no good having schools. So when Liani, who stayed with us and went to school, she did year 12, they thought they'd get into the university. But of course, the private school kids were getting tutored at home as well to do the exams that people had to do to try and get into the free universities. There were free universities run by the state, but the average bear couldn't pass the exam because they had a state school education and no tutoring. So,
I wonder to what extent too, I mean, I know I'm speaking a lot and taking the floor, which is not a good thing, but I wanted to, there's discrimination between the rich and the poor. When you mention, the rich have the right to their children to go to university and not the poor children. And if the poor children did go to university, then they could go return to the community and serve their lot.
yes,
Whereas the rich would probably go to university to serve their lot.
yeah, to make more money. I don't know whether they were consciously biased against the poor. I think, we kind of hear about the white men, particularly at the moment in the States and to some extent here in Australia as well, have this sense of privilege and don't appreciate that other people of other colours and other cultures and women should be able to share that privilege. I think they just had a sense of privilege and it was theirs, so yeah. I've got on the list, I don't know if you could read it from there, but for me, part of the reason I feel so passionately about refugees is because people in Brazil didn't necessarily leave their country to go anywhere just because they lived even in misery. Now, partly because, as I said before, with those toys, they could barely imagine other countries, let alone comprehend the distance to another country or any of that stuff. People only flee misery and poverty when they're frightened. They flee because their wife and their daughters are going to be raped, because their sons are going to be dragooned into the army or something where they'll never probably see them again. They flee because their own lives are in danger. They don't flee because they're just living in poverty. They can cope with that. They don't know much better, but they can cope with that. So I have a deep passion that we should be caring for refugees. But the other part of it is, jolly well, going to learn another language and another culture and all of that. I think, man, we went with prayer support, we went with the right piece of paper in our hands, we went with financial support, all of that, and it was still jolly hard. The language school and trying to get your head into it, and you'd, even after 2 or 3 years, you'd be on the phone to someone, they say, I can't understand a word you're saying, and just hang up, and you'd be wanting to climb through the phone and bop them one, you know. It's so hard to land up in another country and just have to learn a whole way of being in another country. It's so hard. So I have a deep passion for people. I continue to value education, and I actually think all of our children should be learning another language from when they're knee-high to a grasshopper. And possibly in Australia it should be an Indigenous language rather than the French that I was supposed to learn when I was in Gordonvale in North Queensland. Tachiani? No. It was, I think I said the wrong, meningitis. She'd had meningitis at the age of 9 months, and that had profoundly affected her mentally as well as physically. I don't believe so, no. But she could communicate with her smile and one of her arms. The other arm was pretty useless, so look, education's, and as we said before, that cycle where education from generation to generation just doesn't happen. And one of the beauties of living in Australia, I mean, I went to the local state school in Gordonvale, the local high school in Gordonvale. Mum and Dad had 5 kids. It was a bit hard to send us all off to All Souls or wherever else. But those schools, they provide you with basically a first-class education. And so we're hugely blessed. Having seen the impact for Indigenous people in America, in South America, one of the horrible stories we had was people would go and pinch food out of rubbish bins and stuff like that, as some do here in Australia as well. But if they're not careful, they don't realise that the bakery or whatever is wanting to try and get rid of the rats, so they're putting rat sack in with the food. One poor lady had some buns and things that they were feeding this little child on the way on the bus somewhere. The child died, and the bus driver took the child and the mother, put them off the bus. You couldn't have a dead body on the bus, so just dumped them by this Indian couple. There's a kind of a, I don't know, it's not racism per se. I don't think people consciously think they're racist or anti-poor people or anything like that. I think I don't know what it is. I continue to have, I spoke about that movie at the beginning, this passion to see the liberating effect of the gospel, bringing new life to people the world over. And as I said, Freya was probably 16. She'd already left Brazil several years earlier when she did this painting. She's only ever worked in organisations that are to do with, she worked St Vincent de Paul and I don't know, other charities, Even when she went to England, she was working for a hospital there, but it was their fundraising department. And so it was, she's, I suppose, got that same kind of commitment to being about helping to lift people up. Eleanor's a social worker up in Warwick, and working with kids who are teetering on the edge of going to get into big trouble themselves or being taken away from mum and dad because mum and dad aren't coping or whatever. Jeremy too, I said to Jeremy last night as he was cooking the cheese breads that we had today, what would you say is the lasting influence from Brazil? He said, it's made me a communist. That's exactly what I'm going to tell people tomorrow. But basically it was a deep sense of the need for that kind of social undergirding that we, to a large extent, take for granted in Australia and sometimes don't get. We sometimes feel, why do these people need that? Why do they need all of those aids? And it's because if you don't have that undergirding, it means that someone breaks their leg at work and they just got the sack. They're just out of work. They've got nothing. And hopefully their spouse or their uncle or somebody can keep the family alive. It's remarkably easy to slip into not just poverty but into dire poverty, and we know that here in Australia with people ending up sleeping in their cars and things. So each of my children have some sense, and when they first came home and they'd be in their private school here in Australia, fortunately we could get a discount sending them to the local Anglican school for the two younger ones. They would be shocked at their friends who were, demanding their parents brought them the new Blu-ray, whatever, gadget or something or other. They didn't, so I mean they, obviously caught up. It's amazing how quickly the culture of Australia gets back under your skin and you become like everybody else after a while, but still some of that lingering sense of, but this is not quite right. And I suppose that's certainly deeply embedded in me, and I think my kids and my wife as well. So there is an ongoing influence in my life, and because of that, my parishioners are probably thinking Nicholas is completely mad now. What I'm going to be doing in September, I was meant to be doing it now still, I think. I'm not sure what the date is today. No, I would have finished by now. I was going up on the 3rd of September to sit at the cathedral. I've got a cage at home that I've built, and it's my detention centre. And I'm going to sit in my detention centre for 9 days, up there at the cathedral steps, sleeping there and staying there and not eating for 9 days, as my way of saying, we as a country have not offered hospitality to refugees and asylum seekers. For me, that because of my experience in Brazil, it's just is so profoundly wrong. And I just feel the need, so I'm calling it a lament for 9 years of detention. And I don't know, I mean, I'm talking to my spiritual director. I said, I actually had this idea probably about 3 years ago, and I should have done it then because it's only 6 days then. But it just takes a fair bit of courage to get on and do something as mad as that. So, there's no doubt in my mind that our experience in Brazil, apart from that, I get a lot of joy out of having words that I can use, like saudade, a Brazilian word for, it's kind of a bit like loneliness, but you can say I have saudade for Brazil itself. It's that sense of kind of homesickness or loneliness, or that missing something which is part of who I am, I suppose. So it's got things like homesickness involved in it. But so there are words that, from time to time I would use the word jeito, which is that person's way of doing something. It's their jeito, and I don't know, the great footballers of Brazil got their own jeito. They're not very good at playing as a team, but they've got their own way of doing things. Don't often get the teamwork right. But yeah, so you get Pelé and people like that who could do incredible things with a ball, but don't ask them to, the teamwork is not always brilliant. Anyway, so it continues to be a part of who I am, and my son, as I said, cooked up the shima. The other thing they love, how we can get those energy drinks, which has got a thing called, I call it guaraná. My kids and I call it guaraná. I can't say it in Australian, but it's something like guarana or something. Guaraná is a Brazilian fruit, and they use it to make soft drink. My kids grew up on guaraná. It's sold here as an energy drink. It's presumably full of caffeine or something. But we just gave them guaraná soft drink all the time when they were growing up. And there is now a shop where you can buy cans of guaraná. And so every now and again my wife will buy a whole carton of guaraná soft drink, which to us is very special, along with the pão de queijo. And so there are bits and the barbecue. There's a couple of places in town around Brisbane where you can go to a Brazilian churrasco, and I'm not sure they soak it in salt as well as they do in Brazil. You probably all die from heart disease if you live in Brazil eating churrascos all the time, because it's soaked in brine for 24 hours before they cook it. But it's delicious. Hypertension. I've got hypertension now anyway. So look, I've probably spoken for too long. Are there other questions that people have, or other?
Indigenous people. I mean, I share your passion, for, wanting to have this sympathy for people less fortunate than ourselves. There were 350 million Indigenous people around the world, and they all suffer the same fate. Most of them live in dire poverty. They were taken over by colonial settlers like Brazil.
Yep.
Alcoholism is right, malnutrition, disease. They basically they've all suffered the same fate.
Colonialism has done a lot of damage to peoples around the world globally. It's benefited us. We came to Australia, effectively. I mean, some people would say it's not the right word, but invading this country. Others would say, no, we had some kind of right and privilege to be able to come to this country, was effectively not being used to the extent that it's possible. I think you're quite right that there is, and certainly in Brazil and all of South America, Central America, the destruction through disease. A lot of people died just from European diseases like the flu or whatever coming to them. A lot of people died, from the guns and what have you. My son was talking about how in America they had picnics where they go and lynching people in the US. Well, picnics and killing Indigenous people here in Australia was a thing as well. back in the 19th century. So, Indigenous people often regarded in much the same way as you'd regard wild pigs, or you shot them because they're a pest or whatever. So it's hard. Hopefully, it's hard for all of us to even imagine what would make you think like that. But it's not that long ago, and I think in most chunks of Australia today, that belief that Indigenous people are not quite as good as us or something. I'm saying us because we're all white here. So yeah, there's most of those people, if you ask them, are you racist? They would say, no, of course I'm not racist. And I think that's what I was trying to say before to Ian's question, was that people don't think of themselves as racist or having a bias against poor people or having some kind of special privilege. Those things are so part of us that we and what I guess the beauty for us, and I think anyone who really spends time in another country, is that you actually begin to see your own culture from outside. One of the things I used to love was that if I didn't have a particular tool in Brazil, I'd go next door, down the street a bit, and say, look, you don't have a screwdriver, need a particular kind of screw. Oh yeah, I've got one. Yeah, you can borrow that, no trouble. Here I just go down to Bunnings, buy a new one, and I've got all this stuff. That's why I've got a big garden shed, because I've got to have all my junk in it. The stuff that I've used once or twice maybe, and maybe I'll use it again, but in Brazil I'd go and borrow something from the next door neighbour. Anyway, look, I've talked for too long.
Did another missionary follow you?
No, actually a Brazilian priest followed us. He was also, like me, had a Franciscan spirituality. And so, yeah, he came following us. Noel was my colleague at the time. Very sadly, one of my other colleagues, Flavio, he's actually had a car accident since then and died. But he used to work as a mechanic and be a priest on the weekend sort of thing. And I think probably didn't have a good enough work-life balance, because he was working all weekend as a priest and probably was tired driving around the countryside and probably went to sleep at the wheel or something. So, but yeah, Noel was my colleague, continues to be there. I think probably mostly working on the farm with her husband. Sorry, Peter, not Peter.
Father, I enjoyed your talk. It was very enlightening. And congratulate your son on his cooking.
Well, yeah, you'll have to. I'll pass that on to my son, who did that fantastic cooking for us. Caroline very graciously put them in the oven and did the last little bit, which was the easy bit of popping them in the oven to get them ready. So thank you, all of you. I might turn the volume down, but you can. There's that movie. Go ahead.
I'm Peter, for those of you who don't know, I'm the Secretary of Classes and Seniors. Ron is the Chair. Harley's the Treasurer.
I'll just turn the volume down so we can.
Members here, but we would like to thank you. Thank you for making yourself available here for this today. I think this has been a bit enlightening as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
As far as most of us has. And thank you very much for your efforts in this today. Best of luck in the future.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah. I am what I am, and Brazil is a part of me, as is North Queensland. My family tell me you can take a boy out of North Queensland, but you can't take North Queensland out of the boy. It's probably a bit like that with Brazil. If they're playing against each other, I've got a problem, yeah. So that lovely grand final where, and what's his name? Oh, he kicked that final field goal. As a North Queenslander, I was delighted, yeah.
The trouble is, there's been a lot of press about that, and the restaurant stood down for so many games. But you have a look how many games the Cowboys have disallowed teams.
Right.
Really should have been allowed. They don't say anything.
Yeah. There's probably more pain de queijo out there if you'd like some more. You can take a couple of bits home for lunch if you like. Thank you so much for coming and for listening. If you ever want to watch the movie The Mission, I've got my own CD at home. DVD. Thank you. Yeah.
Actually, I was just thinking, when I was doing a postdoc thing at Purdue University in Indiana in 1973, and I shared a laboratory with 3 postgraduate students from Brazil.
Right.
During the summer scholarship program. So that's when I learned that Brazilians speak Portuguese.
Yes. That's the Pope. He drew a line. You guys, the Portuguese, you guys, the Spanish. Brazil pushed that way. Yeah.
About you getting thrombosis when you're sitting in your isolation for the
I will walk around in circles.
I hope so. Your son that's thinking of becoming a communist needs to go to Cuba. You'll see what happens when a country becomes communist.
He's not really a communist, but he's probably got yeah, I think. When I was growing up, I never appreciated unions. We went through that whole period where there was this tension with, and Joe trying to stop the unions, blah, blah, blah. When I went to Brazil, here were these people who were, their conditions were ordinary as, and they went on strike, but only about 10% actually went out on strike. Most of them said, I can't afford to go on strike if I get sacked. And the reality was, all of those people that went on strike, their names were taken. Within 2 years, they're all gone. And I thought, real unions are there for a reason. The stuff that we were fighting against in the 19th century and the early 20th century really has not gone away in most of the world. Yeah.
The intergenerational thing is still, alive and well here.
Oh, very much so.
I was just thinking, when I was a student at Gatton College back in my youth, I used to go on weekends to a cousin's farm in the Lockyer, potatoes and onions.
Yep.
And I was out there one weekend and there was this woman there with her children. She was a potato picker, well, I was sort of...
Yep.
And when these kids found out, or the mother found out I was a student at the college, she was amazed. And it was never in her thinking that her kids could go to somewhere like that.
Yeah.
I mean, they never would. No. They'd just be consigned to needing sort of...
Yeah. It's a very real issue. But occasionally you get kids that are going to our local state schools, partly because of their natural intelligence and maybe something in their personality, but they do shine and they do get into university, but their family will often think, why the hell would you want to go to university? What would you do that for? Yeah.
Do you lock the church up overnight?
We do, but we actually have our sacred space, which is like a little chapel. It's open 24/7. Yeah.
I want to sneak in here one day and print some of the timber out of this.
You can have them. Yeah. Look. No, it's not.
Let me just switch off the... I picked that up through education.
Right.
I haven't experienced it.
I just need to switch off the live broadcast.